Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another segment of our Vaping Life Skills Winter Series. Today, I believe, is session 8, where we will be talking about some smoking information. So we'll talk a little bit about tobacco, a little bit about marijuana, and a little bit about vaping. A lot of very good, useful information. A lot of this is sourced from the CDC and from lahc.org. Generally, mostly credible information, but if you doubt any of the information in this presentation at any time, you're more than welcome to look it up for yourself. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with today's session on tobacco, marijuana, and vaping. So, a couple facts about cigarettes. In a single pack of cigarettes, tobacco leaf is kind of drenched in all these different chemicals, and that's around 600 ingredients. Where the tobacco leaf is kind of tossed in there. However, if anybody's taken a chemistry class, you would know that a ignition or lighting something on fire is going to create a chemical reaction, and as a result, that chemical reaction is going to take some of those ingredients and create multiple byproducts from one ingredient. And that's going to more than triple the amount of chemicals that you end up with that cigarette. So these byproducts go from 600 ingredients to a little bit over 7,000 chemicals as a result of lighting that cigarette. And 70 of these chemicals are carcinogenic or toxic. So these are chemicals that can cause cancer, or they can cause other diseases that could potentially be fatal. But however, we do have one chemical in cigarettes that's relatively important because it's the fundamental root of every addiction that happens from consuming tobacco products. And this is including things like vapes or e-cigarettes and even chewing tobacco. And if you haven't guessed it already, that chemical is nicotine. So nicotine is a very sticky substance, and it tends to bind to everything from your clothes and your hair and your fingertips to the dopamine receptors in your brain. These are receptors responsible for that feel-good feeling you get when you eat a good meal or when you have a good exercise. What happens is nicotine hijacks the system and kind of puts it into overdrive. And this eventually makes it very hard for people to quit using tobacco products, because that dopamine system becomes so used to nicotine that once you cut cigarettes out of your life, it becomes, very tough to kind of deal with some of the withdrawal symptoms of that. So you're dealing with your body trying to get rid of that chemical and also trying to get used to living without it. And so it does have a very pulling effect, and that's why cigarettes or nicotine addiction is one of the hardest addictions to quit. Now let's talk about how smoke travels when we smoke. So let's assume that Jeff and Billy are hanging out. Jeff is red and Billy is blue. So Jeff's smoking a cigarette next to Billy. Jeff is a first-hand smoker, whereas Billy does not smoke. Now, even though he isn't smoking, let's assume for a second they're in an enclosed room, or maybe they're even standing outside right next to each other. And this is kind of a rhetorical question. You have no way of answering this, but do you think that do you think Billy can be affected by Jeff's cigarette? Now, if you guess yes, then you are correct. Even though Billy isn't smoking, probably never smoked and never wants to smoke, he's still in the same vicinity, in the same area that Jeff is in. And so he's evidently going to inhale some of that smoke coming from Jeff's cigarette. This is called secondhand smoke, which I'm sure you've heard of. Unfortunately, this carries the same health risks as firsthand smoke, which is why, back a couple 30 to 50 years ago, you could smoke a cigarette in a restaurant, whereas now there's laws against that, smoke-free laws, and that is to protect people from things like secondhand smoke and even thirdhand smoke. And what is that? Well, let's assume Billy goes home and spends some time with his sister Kate. Now, another rhetorical question: is it possible for Katie to be affected by Jeff's cigarette? Not Billy. Remember, Billy's her brother. Jeff is the person that Billy was hanging out with, and Jeff was the one that was smoking. Even though he's now not even around, there's still that possibility that Katie can be affected by Jeff's smoking. Because like we said, that nicotine is very sticky, and some of those chemicals in cigarettes can bind to your clothes and your skin and your hair. And that stays in the air, so you can see kind of these red dots are the smoke particulates. And when you're hanging out with your little sister, those particulates are gonna kind of attach to her as well, and she's gonna inhale some of that. And that's called third-hand smoke. Even though there's no cigarette around them, there's still some kind of effect that Katie's going to experience. Anybody exposed to secondhand or third-hand smoke are going to encounter some pretty similar health risks that a first-hand smoker would experience, although not as seriously because it's not directly being smoked. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an effect, because there is. Now, hookah is our next tobacco product that we'll talk about, and hookah is mainly popular amongst Middle Eastern cultures, although it's becoming popularized in America as well. And that's what this little tool is right here. So there's a water basin down here, a tube, and tobacco is put in this little bowl, covered with some tin foil, and then heated charcoal or charcoal lit on fire is put on here. And that's gonna cook that tobacco. Then when you draw it in through the tube, it kind of sucks it in through the water. So that's gonna go down, get filtered by the water, and then go in through the tube, and then that is inhaled. Now, given that there is that water basin, can we say that the hookah smoke is being filtered through the water so all those harmful ingredients we talked about are getting filtered? We can't. That's actually false. Water doesn't have the capacity to filter out carcinogens that you can find in tobacco, or anything really. And if you know somebody that smokes hookah, after an hour of smoking hookah, you look in that water basin and the water is still pretty clear. And so there's really no filtration going on there. Smoking hookah is just as addictive as smoking cigarettes because it still contains nicotine. And this is a fact. Every tobacco product that you can think of, including shisha or hookah and vapes or e-cigarettes, contain nicotine. And in fact, Wayne State University did a study where they had a student who already smoked hookah. They didn't force somebody to smoke, but a student who already smokes hookah kind of put him in a controlled setting to smoke hookah for 60 minutes. And measuring the particulates in the air, they came to find that this smoker was exposed to the same amount of nicotine and carcinogens as somebody who would smoke 5 packs of cigarettes. So it's 20 cigarettes in a pack, so that's about 100 cigarettes in 1 hour. That's quite a lot of nicotine and a lot of chemicals that you don't want to inhale. Another misconception is that there's fruit-flavored tobacco in shisha, and for whatever reason, people think that this makes it healthier, and sadly, it doesn't. Tobacco is still tobacco. It still contains those chemicals. It still contains that nicotine, regardless of what you're adding to it. And in fact, these fruit-flavored tobaccos, or that fruit-flavored tobacco is usually dipped in honey flavorings or different kind of flavorings. That's just adding more chemicals to the mix, and that's creating more byproducts, some of which could potentially be carcinogenic. And the last misconception, hookah is healthier than cigarettes. Unfortunately, that's not true. Now, somebody who smokes hookah might smoke less frequently than a cigarette smoker because you're smoking cigarettes, you have a pack that you carry around, whereas hookah, you kind of have to set up the whole thing. But you still get that same level of danger because, like I said, in that 1 hour sitting, you're getting about 100 cigarettes worth of chemicals in your lungs. So the end product is always going to be those 7,000 plus chemicals and the 70 plus carcinogens that you're inhaling. Now we'll talk about vapes. So vapes are a more modern type of smoking device, and they were initially created to kind of help people curb actual cigarette addiction. They were known as e-cigarettes or vapes, and I believe they were created in China around 2008. That's when the first e-cigarette came onto the scene. The scientific term is an electronic nicotine delivery system. In that word, you have the word nicotine. These devices contain a small little replaceable cartridge that is filled with a mixture of this nicotine different kind of flavorings, some chemicals, glycerol and glycol, and all these different chemicals that you should not be inhaling. They can be really toxic. Now, when you inhale or when you draw into the vape, a sensor triggers a vaporizer inside the device to heat up a small amount of this, what's called e-liquid, and then this is drawn into the user's mouth as vapor. Now, in reality, vaping is not a healthier or safer alternative to smoking, even though it's advertised as such, and it's advertised as a way to help people quit smoking. But this hasn't been proven by research. Researchers haven't been able to see vaping as a healthier alternative to cigarettes. However, what we have seen is countless kids, young people, and even older people getting admitted to the emergency room due to something called a VALI, or e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury, which can be anything from bronchitis to pneumonia, lung infection, all of which can be caused by some of these ultrafine particles and these volatile organic compounds that, like I said, should not be inhaled. And so evidently it is possible that somebody could die from e-cigarettes, and some people have died from e-cigarettes. My condolences to anybody who has lost somebody who passed away due to e-valley or e-cigarette related lung illnesses. But we will talk about two people who managed to survive kind of the damages of vaping. A 17-year-old Michigan teen, I believe his name is Daniel Ament, and he had to have a double lung transplant due to his lungs collapsing. What caused that collapse is for sure an infection or some kind of damage that accumulated because of vaping. In the same instance, I believe this is also in Michigan, a 28-year-old woman had to have 4 liters of fluid removed from her chest cavity. 4 liters. So if you know what a 2-liter Coke bottle looks like, that's 2 of those kind of building up in that chest cavity. And this can happen from an infection. Usually our body kind of pulls all our white blood cells into an infection to kind of stop it from spreading. What happens in our chest cavity is there's nowhere else for these white blood cells to go, and they start to pool up, and all this liquid starts to pool up, and it's a very gross kind of condition. Now, this is more common in vapes that are specifically marijuana vapes or contain THC, because a lot of the components that they put in those THC cartridges are very toxic to the lungs and usually create a almost immediate inflammation or inflammatory response in our lungs. And that's usually what can lead to an infection. Since 2019, there have been at least 70 recorded deaths as a result of vaping. And of course, that number continues to rise, especially as more and more young teens and young adults start to vape. Now, we will talk about marijuana. Marijuana is a very interesting, still relatively hot button topic. And so we'll talk about some of the 2 questions, I guess, that are brought up when we discuss marijuana is marijuana a drug or is it a plant? And the other question is it healthy to use? So to answer the first question, is marijuana a drug or a plant? Marijuana comes from the cannabis sativa plant, but if you think about any other kind of medication or any other kind of drug you can get from a pharmacy, almost all of them are derived from some kind of plant. Even though cannabis itself, the cannabis sativa plant, is a plant, the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, the part that induces a high, otherwise known as THC or tetrahydrocannabinol, this is a drug. It has drug-like components, and it's in fact a very powerful drug, especially the way that cannabis is cultivated nowadays. What THC does is it binds to receptors all throughout the body called cannabinoid receptors. These are usually responsible for regulating things like memory and mood and hunger and all of these things, but THC kind of hijacks that system. Normally, we're able to feel happy, hungry, or sleepy naturally without the influence of THC, but after this hijacking, it becomes really difficult for our body to naturally feel these things on its own. So we start to have a more difficult time feeling happy or feeling hungry or going to sleep unless we have THC in our system. And so we kind of become acclimated to it, or we develop a tolerance to this drug. Over time, this is going to take a toll on our physical and our mental health. It can cause many physical illnesses, and so many young kids end up in the emergency room due to either stomach problems or urinary problems or even lung or throat sinus problems. All of these are, of course, linked to marijuana usage. It can also cause psychological or mental health problems. Things like depression, anxiety, or even psychosis are known to be caused or triggered by marijuana. That's why some people that you meet will be very paranoid when they use marijuana, because it does act on our mental health as well. Now, THC itself can be very addictive if it's abused. But if marijuana is smoked consistently, it can be really addictive. And unfortunately, I already checked, there's not many treatment options for marijuana addiction. There are for narcotics and for alcoholics, or people struggling with alcohol addiction. However, it's very, very hard to find treatment options for marijuana addiction. So the best way to avoid this very costly and destructive addiction is to avoid the substance entirely in the first place. Now, there's two sides to the coin of marijuana. There's the medical side of marijuana containing the CBD, cannabidiol, and this is kind of the medical aspect of it. It's not producing any kind of high, or it's not hijacking part of our endocannabinoid system, and so it's relatively non-addictive. And this is what's used in medical settings. It helps relieve pain, it helps regulate mood, prevent seizures for people with epilepsy, and especially after surgery, some doctors will prescribe it as a safer alternative to pain relief medications. Or for cancer patients, it can be a great way to kind of help them with chemotherapy side effects. So that's the medical aspect, and why marijuana is touted as a miracle drug, because of its medical components. But everything that's good has to have some kind of bad, and that is the recreational side of marijuana, which is kind of the addictive part of it. This is what contains that THC and a little bit of CBD, but not enough for it to really have any kind of medical benefit versus the kind of damages that THC could cause. Now, this is what's producing the high or euphoric feeling, and as a result, it can be kind of physically and psychologically addictive. So it's binding to endocannabinoid receptors all throughout our body, and it's also binding to our brain, and so it can affect and addict us in both ways. People generally use recreational marijuana for either for fun or as a way to cope or self-medicate, or maybe as a result of peer pressure. But from what we know, it can have some negative physical and mental effects. This is so far, with the legalization of marijuana, we are seeing more and more people kind of having testaments to how marijuana has damaged or hurt them, and even some testaments for some people who would say that marijuana has helped them. In reality, it's kind of a tipping scale. But from personal experience, working with people who have struggled with addiction, and kind of seeing for myself, living in Michigan, which has legalized recreational and medical marijuana, you kind of witness a detriment that marijuana can cause, especially with the high amounts of THC that marijuana is cultivated with. That THC can be very toxic over certain amounts, and that's kind of really the only problem with marijuana, is those really elevated levels of THC and the kind of tolerance and dependence that it creates after consistent use. Now, the reason marijuana is used to cope and used as a way for fun is because its effects are almost immediate. And so when you smoke marijuana, you quickly experience what is called the high. And this is usually accompanied by a distorted sense of time, and so it's really hard to tell how fast or slow time is going. It causes rapid changes in mood. I can't really elaborate on it, but this particular reason is kind of why marijuana is a really bad way to kind of cope with your problems, because the last thing you want to do is to try to numb a problem that you're dealing with, because that problem's still going to be there. And it's bad if something's changing your mood immediately because you forget that the problem exists in the first place and you're not really addressing it. You're kind of just numbing it and changing your mood with this kind of synthetic high that you can get from marijuana, whereas your brain and your body has the capacity to produce that kind of high naturally through different means, whether yoga or meditation or exercise. You get that same effect on the endocannabinoid system without THC hijacking your body. Just something to think about. It also impairs your body movement, your memory, and your cognition. For certain people, it could potentially cause or exacerbate anxiety or depression. And for certain people still, it can cause a potential case of psychosis. This is where you evidently lose your sense of self and have a hard time telling if you're, in reality or if you're in a dreamlike state. And that can be very disorienting for some people, and it's a reason that a lot of people will abruptly stop smoking once they experience a psychosis, or they'll seek treatment. So very, very scary thing to experience. Potentially, marijuana can cause a couple problems, as we've discussed. And the main issue behind this is it was legalized, which isn't really an issue. That's good. That's progress. But now that it's legal, there's a lowered perception of harm. So people don't think it's as dangerous because it's legal now. And so to those people, I would say that alcohol is still legal, and so are some prescription medications that have some very bad side effects. And so legality doesn't necessarily equate with safety. Using any kind of drug before your brain fully develops, which is around the age of 25, is going to have some negative and lasting effects. And what do I mean by that? So if you're a teen and you're using marijuana heavily and consistently, it can lead to an IQ drop of up to 8 points. Even though marijuana doesn't necessarily kill brain cells like people used to believe, it does slow down the production of new brain cells. So if your brain is still developing, it's going to slow down your brain development. Not to mention that addiction is kind of going to be rooted in your brain, and so your brain is going to develop around that marijuana addiction, and now you have a lifelong marijuana addiction to kind of deal with. Just another thing to keep in mind. This can also be linked to lower grades in school. The user ends up being less likely to graduate high school or go to college. Basically, they're less satisfied with their life because, as I said, THC is giving you that false sense of happiness, that false high. And so when you don't have that THC and your body can't produce that happiness naturally, you become less satisfied with life. You become more likely to kind of settle for a low-income job or a low-income livelihood, and it becomes more likely that you will be unemployed due to the fact that marijuana seeps your motivation as well, and so you start to not want to do things that you normally would want to do, like exercise or work or go to school or play sports or any of those things. And so one thing I want to stress is that addiction does not and will not ever discriminate. There's no sense of a person's background or their race or belief or social class. None of these have any kind of valence. Addiction is going to affect anybody who is susceptible to becoming addicted, and that's basically anyone. There is a stigma around addiction. For whatever reason, people who are addicted are viewed as this or that. I don't want to perpetuate any stereotypes, but those stereotypes are false because we see that the damage that addiction causes is very serious. And so for you guys, as the future of this society, it's up to you, it's up to me, and everyone around us to destigmatize addiction and mental illness so that we can talk about them, because these things are legitimate diseases. and they should be treated as legitimate diseases, just like you would go to a doctor for an infection or maybe even for cancer. You should go to a professional for something like addiction or something like mental illness, just like any other physical illness. And so there's people you can talk to. There are counselors, drug and alcohol counselors specifically, social workers, therapists, and other professionals who are trained with this stuff, and they can help provide treatment or other services that could help you if you are struggling with addiction or if you are struggling with mental illness. And this last slide is just a collection of tobacco-related resources. Like I said, there's not many treatment options for marijuana addiction, but as more people kind of advocate to destigmatize addiction and more people talk about marijuana addiction, I believe the more likely we'll have more and more treatment options for that particular addiction as well. So thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, and I will see you next week. Take care.